Welcome to Chapter 3, Water and Life. This is Dr. Patterson, Biology 181 for Chandler Gilbert Community College. So we're going to do a little overview and then we'll jump into the water. We've only got about 36, 37, 38 slides, so it shouldn't take that long. Just some basic facts here that I want you to read through. Just remember that water is the main reason that we're able to live and the fact that Earth is habitable. The reason that is, in part or predominantly, is because water is a very polar molecule. We discussed that in our last chapter, that polarity and having those opposite charges, those partial positives on the hydrogen and the partial negatives on the oxygen, and then that weak hydrogen bond that forms in between separate molecules. But it's that polarity that really is going to drive so many of the properties that allow water to contribute to Earth and how we live on Earth. So 5 properties here that we need to talk about. There are 2 here that really kind of bump into each other, and that's the ability to moderate temperature and high heat capacity. So if those seem to kind of run together for you, don't let that bother you in the least. Just kind of work through and understand these concepts. So we'll start with cohesion. Cohesion is a phenomenon where 2 like molecules are attracted to are attracted to one another. So water molecules stick to water molecules. That's the beading effect. You've seen beading on your windshield, on your windows, on just about any surface where water will bead together. That's cohesion. Why that's important, we'll see in the next image, but cohesion actually is part of what allows water to move against gravity in, let's say, a tall tree or in any plant for that matter. Cohesion plus adhesion is what allows that. So adhesion is an attraction between different substances. So example being between the water molecule here and the cell of the plant, so the water conducting cells of the plant. And this attraction between the water keeps it close or keeps it bound together, but then there's also an attraction between the water molecule and the cell of the plant, and that's cohesion. I'm sorry, that's adhesion. Between the water molecules is cohesion, the water molecule and the cell wall of the plant is adhesion. It's that cohesive force that also allows for surface tension. So in our in-person lab, we have an experiment that we run with drops of water on pennies, and that we see that water bleb over the surface, and that's because of surface tension. Surface tension happens because of the cohesion between the water molecules. For those of you not in our in-person lab, it's the same as if you fill a cup and then you can add, if you go very slowly or if you go carefully, you can actually overfill the cup and you'll see that bleb of liquid over the top, over the rim of the cup, and that's, again, cohesion. Next up, we've got one of those whiteboard questions. So for those of you in class, we usually divide the classroom. Those of you not in a classroom setting with us, in the online or the hybrid version, go ahead and take a minute or 2, answer these on your own little personal whiteboard or piece of paper or whatever works for you. I'm going to count to, you're going to want to pause your video. I'm going to count to 5 and then I'll give you answers. Okay, so cohesion on the left, adhesion on the right. Certainly there are other examples you could give, and they don't have to be water, although that is what we're talking about here. So I just gave you 2, an example for each, but your example might be different. Don't fret if yours wasn't the same as mine. And next up, we need to talk about how water moderates temperature. So what water does is it absorbs heat from warmer air and releases heat to cooler air. It's why San Diego keeps a very small range of temperatures all year round because they're near that very large body of water. Los Angeles is similar. Um, any of those coastal cities, Santa Barbara, if you go up further, even San Francisco. Well, it is colder in San Francisco. Their swings aren't great. Here in the desert, we have really large swings in our temperature, even within one day. And especially so if we leave the city and we go out into the desert where we lose all that asphalt. So water can absorb and release large amounts of heat with only a very small change to itself. And that's what is meant by moderation of temperature. Before we step into the next part, we need to grab a couple of definitions. So I've got a few slides here that we're going to go through some things. When we talk about heat and temperature, we need to talk about heat. So I'm at the second bullet. And what is heat? Well, heat is the measure of the total amount of kinetic energy due to molecules moving. And molecules are constantly moving. Great, that's fabulous. But what's kinetic energy? Kinetic energy is just the energy of motion. It's that motion. So when I have this motion of these molecules, okay, and they're moving around and they're bumping into each other, the total of all of that is called heat. Temperature is a measure of the intensity of the heat. How much heat is there? The intensity of it. Is there a lot? Is there a little? But temperature is really due to the average kinetic energy of the molecules. When we measure them, we have to have units. That's just a given, right? So the Celsius scale is the one used in most parts of the planet. Here in the US, we hang on to that Fahrenheit scale. But Celsius is a way of measuring temperature. Calories are the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So how many calories does it take? How much heat does it take to take 1 gram of water and raise it 1 degree Celsius? Don't confuse that calorie with the calories you see on food packages. The calories on food packages are labeled calories, but they're truly kilocalories or kcals. And simple math conversion, 1 kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. One other term that I want to give you here in our units is a joule. I think we come across it 2 times later in the semester, so I just want you familiar with the term. You don't have to remember the conversion at all. If I ever have you do math, I'll give you that conversion and you can do the math for me. But a joule is another unit of energy. And a joule is equal to 0.239 calories. Conversely, 1 calorie is equal to 4.184 joules. Again, you don't have to memorize those. So with those new definitions in hand, kinetic energy, heat, temperature, calories, knowing that we're working on a Celsius scale, that sort of stuff, we can now talk about the phenomenon that is water's high specific heat. So specific heat of any substance, water or any other substance, is how much heat does it have to absorb or lose to change its temperature by 1 degree. 1 degree, 1 gram of it by 1 degree Celsius. So it's you see how it's similar to the concept of the moderation of temperature. The thing about water is that it has what's considered a very high specific heat. Okay? It takes a whole calorie to move 1 gram 1 degree Celsius, and that's a considerable amount. What that means for us is that water doesn't change its temperature easily. It can absorb a lot of heat before it's actually going to change. Here in Phoenix, here in the valley, we'll notice that in our swimming pools, right? So it has to get really warm outside in our high 90s, low 100s, several days in a row before those swimming pools really start to warm up. That's because it takes a whole lot of heat to be absorbed to raise 1 gram of water, clearly much more in a swimming pool, but 1 gram 1 degree Celsius. And the opposite is true as well. it has to release a lot of heat before we're going to drop that temperature 1 degree Celsius. And why does that happen? That happens because of those cool little hydrogen bonds we talked about. So when hydrogen bonds break between those separate water molecules, heat gets absorbed. We absorb heat in. When those hydrogen bonds form, heat gets released. And so it's that breaking and unbreaking, breaking and unbreaking, or rather breaking and reforming, if you prefer that terminology, of those hydrogen bonds that really facilitate this high specific heat. And what it's going to do overall is it's going to minimize temperature fluctuations so that organisms can live. My fish are very, very happy about this because we set our air conditioning in our home, or even our heat for that matter, on a pretty wide range. We let it get pretty warm in the house in the summer, and we let it get pretty cool in the winter. And so what that means is, even though we have that wide range of the ambient temperature in our home, it doesn't affect our aquaria quite so much. Whiteboard, for those of you playing at home, go ahead and try and answer these. I'll count to 5 and then I'll move on. Okay, so my first answer is really extensive. I don't believe that anyone is probably going to answer, if that were an exam question, is going to answer it quite that in depth. And as I said, I specifically don't require that you know 4.184 joules. Really what I want you to get from that is that your definition of that water has a high specific heat capacity, it's the highest of any liquid, that it means that we have to absorb a lot of heat to change 1 gram of water's temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So those are the big concept I'm going for. And again, I want those answers in your own words. The second one is about the hydrogen bonds and releasing, and you'll notice a little explanation I left there. So when heat is absorbed, hydrogen bonds are broken, and those water molecules can move more freely. When the temperature of the water decreases, the hydrogen bonds are formed and they release a considerable amount of energy. So that's a little bit of background there for you if that helps understand the concept. Evaporative cooling is something we know a lot about. So evaporation is when you move from a liquid to a gas. The heat of vaporization is the amount of heat a liquid has to absorb for 1 gram to be converted to gas. So as a liquid evaporates, the surface left behind cools. This is sweating. So you develop that thin layer of sweat or perspiration on the surface of the skin. As it evaporates, the skin left behind cools. Okay? This is another thing that helps to stabilize temperatures of organisms in bodies of water. So remember, a lot of this planet is water, and so it's all of these properties that we've been talking about with the water that allow life to survive. The other part of this is the insulation. So ice floats. I think we know that. So ice floats because the hydrogen bonds in ice are more organized. They're more ordered. And so they make the ice less dense. There's actually spaces in between the molecules because we get a very distinct ordered fashion. Okay? In water, we've got more motion. We've got hydrogen bonds breaking and reforming and breaking and reforming. And so it has a different density to it than we have over here with those stable hydrogen bonds in the cooler temperatures. What we're going to get is we're going to get our greatest density at about 4 degrees Celsius. Why this is key, this floating component, is because if ice sank, we would kill off all the life within a body of water. if you think about it, we think about what lives in the water and we think there are fish. Now let's pick a big or a very large body of water. So we've got, the apex predators, the orca and the shark. And those guys are going to eat smaller predators. They're going to eat smaller fish. And those fish are going to eat smaller fish, and we're going to keep dropping down on that food chain until we get to those organisms that eat the plants and eat the algae, right? Okay, where do the plants and the algae grow? They grow on surfaces. They grow from the floor of the ocean. And if ice sank, it would sink all the way down, it would cover that vegetation, and we would cut off the very start of the food chain. So without ice floating, there is no life in our bodies of water, and that's very, very, very problematic. So that's important. And I think our last one we're going to talk about is solvents. So water and its polar nature is an excellent solvent. It's a great solvent. But before we talk about that, we need to grab some definitions, both on this slide, and I think it's just this slide. I don't think we have any on the next slide. So solution is a liquid that is homogeneous. Everything is within it and equally distributed. How we get a solution is because we have a solvent and a solute. So a solvent is something that dissolves something else. A solute is the thing that gets dissolved. So we want to make lemonade. Great. You're going to squeeze a whole bunch of lemons. And you're going to add that lemon juice to some water. Okay. It's really, really tart. So you add some sugar. The sugar you stir and it eventually dissolves. So the water and the lemon juice were the solvent, and the solute was the sugar that got dissolved. An aqueous solution is one in which water is the solvent. So let's say that we made hummingbird food. Let's say we made sugar water for hummingbird feeder. Then we have an aqueous solution because the only solvent present is the water and the sugar. Why is water such a good solvent? Well, again, because its polarity. Its polarity allows those hydrogen bonds, remember we said it allows them to break easy, but it also allows them to form easily. And, excuse me, when an ionic compound like, I don't know, sodium chloride, salt, is dissolved in water, excuse me, each ion gets surrounded by a sphere of water. And so we build this hydration shell around each ion. So you'll get little water molecules that will completely surround a chloride. You'll get little water molecules that completely surround the hydrogen. And that's how we dissolve them. We separate the sodium from the chloride by surrounding them with molecules of water. Okay? And that surrounding molecules of water is called a hydration shell. That's your bolded vocab word. Water can also dissolve compounds made of non-ionic polar substances. Water can even, given enough time, water can even dissolve very large polar molecules like proteins, as long as those proteins have some ionic and polar regions to them. They don't have to be completely ionic or completely polar, but they do need to have some of those regions available. 3 vocab words here that we need to grab: hydrophilic, hydrophobic, and colloid. Use your knowledge of language. Don't get hung up necessarily. So hydro is water. You know that. Philic. Maybe you don't know philic, but think of philanthropist. Think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So philic is love. So hydrophilic substances are ones that have an affinity for water. And an affinity is how much it likes something else. So an affinity is how much you like something. My daughter, for example, has a very strong affinity for chocolate. My son, not so much. his affinity is more for fruit. Hydrophobic, on the other hand, phobic is fear or dislike. So a substance that is hydrophobic is one that does not have an affinity for water. Okay. If I go back to the example of my children, my son is chocophobic, I guess. He doesn't have a strong affinity for it. He's not really afraid of chocolate. He just doesn't really care for it. Oil molecules, vegetable oil, any sort of lipid, are considered hydrophobic. They don't really care to be surrounded by water, and that is because they have relatively nonpolar bonds. They're still covalently bonded, but they're nonpolar, and so we don't get those partial charges, and they're not fond of being in the presence of water. Okay, colloid is your definition there. I think your book and I think some of our other examples have gone into a little bit more depth about the colloid if you want to read about that. And then we're moving into, I don't know, probably our last 10 or 12 slides here. So remember that most biochemical reactions occur in water. Your body is predominantly water. The liquid in your cells is predominantly water. There's liquid between your cells. That's predominantly made of water. Blood has a very large water component to it. And so what ends up happening is we have this very wet, this very water-based environment. And the chemical reactions that are going to happen in those environments happen because of the collisions between molecules. Okay? So because everything's in water, we have to have higher concentrations of solutes in order for them to bump into each other. Okay, so why that becomes important is because we need to talk about maintaining neutrality. So we need to talk about acids and bases and pH and buffers and those sorts of things. Simply because we're in this aqueous environment. We have these aqueous solutions, and bodies and cells and blood and all of those liquids need to maintain homeostasis, needs to maintain a pretty tight pH. And so to have that conversation fully, we need to get the background information first. So a hydrogen atom in a hydrogen bond between two water molecules can shift from one to the other. So the hydrogen atom leaves its electron behind, and it just goes off and it becomes a positive. It becomes a proton. It becomes a hydrogen ion. What's left behind, the molecule with the extra proton, is now a hydronium. So what ends up happening is we get an H3O. We really just talk about it as an H+, and that's from the bullet above. But if you see it written, if you see it in the text, if you watch Crash Course Biology on YouTube with Hank Green, he really talks about the hydronium ions and what's really going on there. For our purposes, we can just talk about it as a hydrogen ion and call it H+. The molecule that lost its proton, that now has the extra electron, is a hydroxide ion, and we write that as an OH with a superscript negative. And those are really our key players when we talk about acids, bases, and pH balances. So an H+ or a hydrogen ion, which is a proton, and then a hydroxide ion, which is a negative charge. So this is what a pH scale looks like. Again, the Hank Green video on pH is great. It's a chemistry video, but it really goes into this well. So 7 is neutral. Pure water is considered neutral, and it has a pH of 7. The scale truly goes above 14 and below 0, but you're probably not going to be exposed to those substances. You won't be at this level, and wouldn't be until you were much, much further along in chemistry or biochemistry. So between 9 and 14 is considered alkaline. I know your image there shows between 8 and 14. And they consider acidic anything from 6 down to 0. biochemically speaking, a lot of times we'll take 6 to 8 as neutral, with 7 being the true neutral, and then everybody else on the opposite sides being acids or bases. The closer you are to neutral, the weaker you are. So a 5 is a weak acid, whereas a 1 or a 0 are very strong acids. A 9 is considered a weak base or weakly alkaline, whereas 13 and a 14 are strong bases or strongly alkaline. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this scale to describe whether solutions are acidic or basic. So an acid or a base. Acids are any substances that can increase the hydrogen ion concentration. How do they do that? They donate a hydrogen proton. A base is any substance that can reduce the hydrogen ion concentration. How does it do it? It takes a free hydrogen and absorbs it. It bonds it in. Okay? So as the hydrogen ion concentration increases, as I get more hydrogen ion concentration, the pH number goes lower. So a pH number of 1 on your scale, that orange color, has a lot more, has considerably more, has actually 1,000 times more hydrogen ions than a solution that has a pH of 4. Okay? So the smaller the number, the more hydrogen ions. The larger the number, the fewer hydrogen ions. So a substance with a pH of 13 is going to have 1,000 times less hydrogen ions than something with a pH of 10. Those are tenfold steps. So 13 to 12 is 10, 12 to 11 is 10, 10 times 10 is 100, 11 to 10 is another 10, so there's your 1,000. That was kind of quick, so if that doesn't make sense, send me a message or ask me in class and we'll talk about that. Whiteboard question for you. I'll count to 5 and give you answers. Okay, so this talks about the pH scale. It talks about a negative log. What you need to grab from here is, and I'm not going to make you explain a log or even a negative log to me, but what you need to understand is that the concentration of the hydrogen ion multiplied by the concentration of the hydroxide ion will give us a 10 to a negative 14. So the pH of a solution can be determined by the negative log of the hydrogen concentration. Basically, if I tell you that the hydrogen ion concentration is 10 to the minus 7, you know you're going to look at that exponent up there, that negative 7, you're going to turn it into a positive, and you're going to say the pH is 7. You can work that backwards as well. I can tell you that the pH is 2, and you're going to tell me that the hydrogen ion concentration is 10 to the negative 2. Not terribly difficult. So here's an example for you. And I don't think I did an answer key to this one. So I'll just pause here. I'll wait a few seconds and then I'll tell you the answers. Okay, so a solution that has a pH of 3 is going to have, is going to have a hydrogen ion concentration of 10 to the negative 3. Okay, so that's 10 and then negative 3 up in the superscript. So look at your next one. A hydrogen ion concentration of 10 to a negative 12. Remember what we said to do. We said to take that exponent up there, that negative 12, turn it positive, and just give the number out. So that solution will have a pH of 12. This, it shouldn't say plus, it should say multiply, so we need to go back and fix that. There's a typo there, so what you're going to do is I'm going to grab a pen. I think I'm going to grab a pen. We're going to cross this out. Oh, it's green. That's not helpful. And we're going to put an X here to show that we're going to multiply. So we're going to multiply those to get to the 14. This slide is meant to just give you this whole, this is base, this is acidic, this is neutral in the middle. Why pink and blue? Because your pH papers or your litmus papers turn blue indigo with even purplish with the pH being, sorry about that, with the pH being basic, and then they'll turn more pink for an acidic pH. And there's just some common household or common liquids there that you might be familiar with. Acidic solutions have pH values less than 7. If the pH is less than 7, somewhere between 6 and 0, then it's acidic. Basic or alkaline solutions have pH values greater than 7. Most of the biological fluids in mammals are somewhere between 6 and 8. Okay? Buffers are how we maintain those biological 6 to 8 range of all of those fluids. So buffers are substances, acids and bases actually. Buffers are substances that minimize the changes or fluctuations in the hydrogen and the hydroxide ions. Okay? Most buffers are an acid-base pair. They work together and they reversibly combine the hydrogen ions. Why that's important is when we start talking about the effects on bodies, but also on environments. So because of my background, my first instinct is always to give you a body example. But here we're going to talk about something different. We're going to talk about the environment. We're going to talk about acid precipitation. And we define acid precipitation as any precipitation, rain, snow, fog, any of it, that has a pH lower than 5.6. Acid precipitation gets caused by pollution. So it's the mixing of different pollutants with water in either the air or in a water source that then gets evaporated into the air. And what happens is, because it enters up into the air in circulation, we can transfer it and we can have those pollutants and that acid rain fall a considerable distance from the source. Okay? So why that's important environmentally is that acid precipitation, that 5.6 or even lower, more acidic, can damage life in lakes, in streams, in the areas even around the lakes and stream, in the vegetation. So we change the soil chemistry and we'll see the decline in forests, which is what our next slide is actually. This was a forest region. It doesn't really look very foresty now. And that's just because of acid rain. Pollutants that were picked up elsewhere, carried through the air, got deposited down in precipitation in this area, and over the course of time, we saw a change in the soil chemistry and the water quality, and the forest died off. How does that happen? Burning fossil fuels. That's one of our biggest threats to water quality. And it's the carbon dioxide that gets released from the fossil fuel combustion, and what that does is it contributes to the warming of the earth, called the greenhouse effect. Yes, greenhouse effect is real. And we get acidification of the oceans. When we acidify the ocean, we see a decrease in the ability of corals to form calcified reefs. That's exactly what's happened to the Great Barrier Reef. If you intend to see it, you need to see it soon, because it's now hit critical mass, it's dying off, and it's not. Probably, they're saying almost 100% certain it's not going to come back this time. And that's got a lot to do with the increased temperatures that we see in those waters. So that is the end of our slide. About 35 minutes, not too bad for us. Feel free to go back and watch again. Shoot me any messages if you've got any questions. But I'll get this loaded up onto our web.